I've been trying to close these meeting controls along the way, each step of the way here. Okay, here we go. All right, so today I'm going to talk about virtual reality goes to war. And it's a very challenging area, but an area where I think there's been a good bit of research to document the value of applying VR in this clinical area. And I'm going to do a deeper dive, right? Whereas my last talk was more general across the whole field. I'm going to do a deeper dive into what is exposure therapy and how it's applied, and a number of different projects that go beyond just combat-related PTSD. And if with enough time, I'm going to do a little bit of talking on the use of virtual humans for reducing stress and trauma as well. So you guys have already seen this before, so I'm not going to bore you with this picture of this building, but I am going to just say all of our work, and this is videos from some of the early days of some of our work, has continued to evolve to the present day. And I'm rather proud that we have been able to take certain core areas and continue to evolve them, because it's the only way the science is going to get better, if you have people that stay focused and continue to take an evolutionary approach towards a generation of knowledge in these areas. So, as we talked about before, expose, distract, motivate, measure, and engage. Well, now we're going to focus specifically on exposure. And we're going to do a little bit deeper dive into exposure therapy. And just to get this out of the way, the theoretical basis for exposure therapy is helping a patient to confront or reprocess very difficult emotional memories, and to reduce the dysfunctional associations that have been established between the feared stimuli and an event in the world that poses no threat. And if you look at, basically Pavlov's dog and conditioning, the real core to trauma is that it is an extreme case of conditioning. So that, if you say take a baby and you ring a bell before conditioning, nothing happens. But then you expose somebody to a negative consequence during the conditioning phase. This is where you start to see long-term conditioning problems, as was seen with one of the icons of psychology in the early days, little Albert, Watson's first classical conditioning example. And we like to say that we focus on extinction learning, that we present the feared stimuli, but without the actual negative consequence. That when people have a fear of flying, they're typically, extremely afraid of flying. But, if they honestly looked at it over time, flying is a much safer way of transport than driving in a car. And so there's a lot of things that people avoid or are fearful of that don't really pose a real fear. They may have the experience of fear, but that can be reconditioned or deconditioned. Or, you can also bring in cognitive processing. It's not just the idea of it being a behavioral conditioning paradigm. There's a lot of work that's done with trauma where really it's the patient's trauma narrative. It's getting them to be able to tell their story and be listened to have an empathetic person with them. And that empathetic person that they trust can push them to experience things that they wouldn't experience, they would avoid otherwise. So, I always like to, whenever I do a talk on exposure, show some of the early work, and this is for fear of claustrophobia, fear of enclosed places, and this was Christine Batella's work, a bunch of slides she gave me back in 1997, or for claustrophobia, they put you in this room, they close the door, and then they gradually move the walls in on you. And I hope she's watching, so she's seeing that I'm presenting some of her early work. But fear of heights was the next area where, by gradually exposing people to feared situations like height situations, people would decondition their fear. And as we saw in the earlier talk, very primitive stimuli, but we could fool the brain. And over time, we saw things get better. But even in the beginning, here's another example of somebody from 1995 engaging in a fear of heights scenario. You can see how primitive it was.
All right, I think we've got a virtual drunk.
That's right. Here we go.
This is Barbara Roth's policy.
That's pretty fast. Whoa, whoa, look at that. Wow. Oh, that's great.
You want to dangle your foot over the edge? How does that feel?
Feels pretty good.
With the price of computing power coming down fast, it won't be long until virtual reality systems could be cheap enough for every therapist to have one in their office. And it will become even harder to tell where the virtual world ends and the real one begins.
Whoa, whoa. Oh, wait. That is really something. I've had my eye on the floor, and the floor really came up at me.
Where's the motion?
Don't do this at home, kids.
Okay, so a relatively famous person there doing it. And of course, you saw this before. But here's a few of the other types of scenarios that have been out there. I try to mix it up with a little bit of different stuff from different groups and so on. And I think we basically know the applications here. One application I find interesting is out of Oxford VR, Dan Freeman's work, showing that maybe we can push a little more therapy into the patient's home. So in this study, they actually showed good clinical outcomes from people doing exposure therapy at home. They had a clinician, they had a psychologist diagnose them and set up a treatment plan, something I think is the bare minimum, but they could do all the therapy at home with a standalone VR headset. So optimism there. There's other studies being conducted in the same fashion. And we have to take a careful and ethical watch on that. But back in 2008, our group and another group both published meta-analyses studying the data up to that point, 2008. And basically, VR was on the way up, showing that it had value. In 2015, Paul Emmelkamp's group also not only showed that the data up to that point was positive, but that it made a difference in a person's exposure in the real world, that once they went through VR therapy, they actually, did things in the real world. It wasn't just they checked off a rating scale and said, oh yeah, I'll be likely to fly in a plane or climb up on a skyscraper. They actually did it. More recently, the article I cited from before, documented that, this was, I think, the final nail in the coffin of the people that were negative about VR, that it doesn't work or that it's dangerous. It's neither of those things. The deterioration analyses were conducted to look at people that didn't benefit from VR and found it was no different than people in other applications, in other types of in other types of therapies, active therapies, that the negativity rate, not just the people that got better, but the people that didn't do any better or did worse, was no more so than traditional therapy. So anyway, I'm building up to the point here that, okay, going from general anxiety disorders, panic disorder, fear of heights, flying, public speaking, spiders, phobias, so forth. Now going to PTSD, which follows a similar type pattern. And in 2008, when we were in the middle of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Institute of Medicine in the United States did a deep review of all the treatments for PTSD and came to the conclusions that there wasn't sufficient evidence for any of the treatments except for an exposure-based trauma-focused model, helping the patient to confront their fears, not avoid their fears. And if you look at people with PTSD, you know, everybody immediately after a trauma doesn't feel very good. They feel bad. But if you look at people over time, and this is why we don't diagnose PTSD until at least 30 days post-trauma, over time, most people get better. They still have bad memories. It's still a difficult event for them, but they aren't avoiding. They aren't hiding out in their house. They aren't doing things that are counterproductive or unsafe, self-medicating and so on. It's the people in this bar in the red line that we need to focus on. PTSD is a unique phenomenon. It's not something that is just like, oh, get over it. It's a real condition, but we need to be able to take an approach that helps them to move forward in their treatment at a pace they can handle. And that's what I'll make the case for VR on. Now, why use virtual reality? Well, you know, the traditional method works well, but we need to activate emotion. And that is one of the key things across all forms of therapy using virtual reality, is activating people's emotions and helping them to reprocess those emotions in ways that are more adaptive or functional for their well-being. And that's why VR has been applied. Now, over the years, we weren't the first people to use virtual reality for prolonged exposure for PTSD. Here are some examples. Virtual Vietnam, World Trade Center, bus bombing scenario, Christine Batella's Emma's War, and the data from the very beginning, Barbara Rothbaum's work in 1998, showing in a case study a significant decrease in PTSD, and then small controlled trials, not uncontrolled trials, or small trials of maybe 30 people in a group, showing good clinical outcomes as well. But for some reason, that research never got funded. So it was sort of a failure of the ability to leverage the technology at that time, perhaps because the technology was very expensive at the time. Okay, this is from the World Trade Center, the first case study, and you can see the dramatic change from session 1 to session 14 on these various scales. And later on, a little bit larger study, 17 patients, also showed clinically meaningful and statistically significant reductions in PTSD that were not achieved by other people. People that had tried other clinical conditions. Okay. Now, our work commenced in 2000, and it was called Brave Mind. That was the name of the software tool. And it really commenced in 2004 when people started to recognize that we're having significant problems with PTSD from our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those problems, this was an article from 2019, continue to go on. There's still a lot of people that need help. Now, when we started, we didn't have a lot of funding. We didn't have any funding for our first version, which you're going to see now, but we were able to take a video game and modify it to some degree and show it off, go to conferences, virtual reality conferences, American Psychological Association, and show it and beg for money, basically. And this is what that looked like. You know, it was from this video game called Full Spectrum War. You could click a button on the screen, put an ambient sound, click another button, and there would be gunfire. And you could click another button, bring a helicopter. Well, we didn't have a lot of funding, but after that article I had showed a second ago from the New England Journal of Medicine came out, people came approaching us saying, all right, we want to fund this work. We want to give it a shot, give it a go. And so the fellow there in the uniform on the left at the top, he was a graduate student. He just finished his PhD, went in the military, and he went to Iraq and brought a version of the system with him, as you can see here on the back of a Humvee, and basically had people try it, not for treatment, but to tell us what we got right and what we got wrong. And that is really at the core of developing good virtual reality software. You got to incorporate your targeted user group into the mix to get their feedback. After that, we got funded. We built out a 4-scenario version. These are the environments up here, 2 of them. And the feedback that we got from those soldiers in Iraq, which is listed, some of it here, really drove our development. So we were able to develop this armed with information about what would make the best application. Here's somebody you may recognize.
I have to tell you, I was stunned by my reaction. I mean, I know it's only a simulation, but my reaction was so powerful. What I didn't show you was that I went through that simulation 2 more times. And I can't say that it ever really got any easier, but I did feel more in control. And from what the psychologists tell me, that's the goal. Face your fears until you can control them, maybe even defeat them.
So that's Sanjay Gupta from CNN. He still appears on that. But this is what it looks like. What the world is.
Wi-Fi hay lấy hố.
Like going through it there, it's not going through my head at night when I'm on or when I'm with my wife, when times when I don't want it to come up and me start thinking about it. Traumatic things are not normal. You cannot handle the things that you've seen and done. And this is a tool that has helped me out tremendously.
Reliving the worst moments of his life has helped him to move on with his life.
I'm probably about 80% of who I was before I left, but I think that's pretty good after seeing and doing the things that we've done.
For Nightline, this is Dan Harris.
So one thing to keep in mind, though, is that this is not a toy. It's not a video game. It's a tool. I mean, the technology doesn't fix anyone. It's the tool in the hands of a well-trained clinician. And it takes a lot of training in order to deliver exposure therapy, because it's not just sitting and talking to somebody and providing supportive counseling. You're having to push the patient into confronting their trauma experiences. The way we do it with BraveMind is to build a clinical control panel for all 14 worlds. We have a variety of worlds that are in the desert, worlds that are in the mountains, in the cities, and so forth. And that way we can put a person in a world that is tailored to what their traumatic experience is. They can go into the world. The clinician can control everything, the time of day, the lighting conditions, the number of people in the world, where a bomb goes off. And the patient is encouraged to narrate the experience as if they're going through it in real time again. And they talk about it. And as they talk about it, becomes more emotionally evocative over time, and people start talking about more things that they hadn't talked to anyone about before. And this is why I say there's a strong cognitive process here, that people are engaging at a cognitive level and confronting the different challenges that they face. But as they do it more and more and more, the anxiety level diminishes. And this is what a typical session would look like, with a screen behind the patient that the clinician can see with their control panel that they activate the stimuli on. We also use a scent machine, we use physical props, we use a bass shaker, multi-sensory stimuli to make the experience even more engaging. Or you can turn it down and make it more, make it less provocative. And so you can help the patient to pace their experience. There's a new scent machine out, this little device under the headset there, which is, I think, the next step up in delivering the sense of smell, something we haven't tested, but we believe that the sense of smell is key to memory and emotion. And that for some patients with our old smell machine, they really, when they smelt diesel fuel or gunpowder or cordite, it really activated them. We also use a fake weapon where you can't fire this gun, but you can hold on to it. Soldiers told us in the beginning that when they were operating the first version with a gamepad, it was okay for driving a Humvee or a vehicle, but when they were on a foot patrol, it was unnatural and distracting. So this is why we got the physical prop, not to shoot, but to make it more natural. Also, our colleagues in Norway who are using the system are using an omnidirectional treadmill because they believe that the actual walking in the world makes it more engaging, more realistic. Okay. So clinical research, let's talk about some of the data. This is our first clinical trial, pre-treatment, post-treatment, and 3-month follow-up, showing clinically significant and statistically meaningful reductions. This puts a finer point on it. Of the first 20 treatment completers, 16 no longer met PTSD criteria, whereas 4 did not benefit. More recently, you see this, and this is from an intensive treatment trial. This is 3 weeks where you fly to Orlando, you go to the university, you stay at a hotel, and you go in each day and do exposure every day. And in the afternoon, you do other forms of therapy. So those are really good results. This is Barbara Rothbaum, who you saw in the video with the fear of heights. Her lab did this and tracked people over the course of a year and found that people continued to get better. After they had gotten over the hardest part of post-treatment, they started to engage in the world and started to have a life again and continued to get better. Additionally, with that work, they also looked at startle response, physiological reactivity, which is a key factor for coming up with a more objective strategy for diagnosing PTSD, as well as cortisol reactivity, which is also a stress hormone that might be a more effective way of coming up with an objective diagnosis, something that you can measure so that you can measure somebody before treatment, like in this case, post-treatment, and at 6-month follow-up, and find that they don't react in the same way that they did prior to treatment. Okay, let's go to the next one here. This was the first randomized controlled trial that was conducted in this area. And this one showed equivalent findings to traditional prolonged exposure. However, it used the very first version that only had 4 worlds. So we didn't have a lot of coverage of the different experiences that we do today. And today, now we have new trial results from November of last year, the largest randomized controlled trial in the literature. It also showed that, again, across all subjects to around 200 patients, that the over 10 trials, 10 sessions, treatment trials, that everybody did quite well. We didn't see a difference between the VR and the traditional exposure, but we did see equivalence. And in our predictions, we predicted that people with comorbid depression, which was really a large percentage of the people in the trial, that they would do better. That VR is an emotionally evocative technology, and people that are depressed oftentimes are hard to emotionally activate. And you need that activation to engage somebody in the confrontation and reprocessing of their difficult emotional memories. As well, I mentioned 76.6% of people would have preferred, if they had a choice, they would have preferred VR to the traditional methods. So not only do we have something that has improved efficacy, particularly with people with depression, but it also has a better draw. And this is one of the big problems with this kind of treatment, is getting people to come in for treatment. You know, people will suffer for months, years, decades with PTSD and not think anything can help them. And it's unfortunate. I mean, you think about when you have a toothache, you know, nobody likes to go to the dentist, but you go because you want that damn pain to stop. But people sometimes with PTSD will go a lifetime and not get the treatment that they could benefit from. So getting people into treatment to begin with, whether they decide to go with VR or the traditional methods, doesn't matter. As long as we get them in there, we can make a difference. Another area is sexual trauma in the military. And we did this project a couple of years back. We're rebuilding it all now. But military sexual trauma is a big problem, but it's not just in the military. It's outside at military bases in the United States. We built out this scenario and basically built out civilian worlds as well as combat worlds. We have a perpetrator that might follow you around, a male or a female, that can be different skin tones and so forth. So it's really provocative. And because of that, we were held back to only conducting a safety and feasibility trial because of the intimate nature of this type of violation. And the good news was only 11 patients, but a good start. We got statistically significant and clinically meaningful reductions in PTSD in that sample, as you can see on the right-hand side, and reductions in depression with an effect size of 0.94 as well. And a CAPS scale, a common measure in PTS, 1.11. So we're on the right track. That is going to be released shortly. We're rebuilding everything to make it more effective and for a wider population, not just military sexual trauma. We've done a lot of other research in other areas with this application. I mentioned the startle response, the physiological reactivity. Well, we've published about 6 studies looking at physiological reactivity as a more objective measure of PTSD, not only to measure to detect whether somebody has it, but if they're improving with treatment. Also, Mike Roy, a good colleague and friend of mine, did an fMRI study back in 2014, the last version of it, showing that before and after treatment in VR, that changes in brain activation occurred in the directions that would be predicted based on our current conception of brain functioning. So if you take, for example, the amygdala, we saw a drop off in the activation levels of the amygdala, which is a key element there. So, you know, a lot of good research. We're expanding the applications all the time. This is for combat medics who have a little bit different job than traditional war fighters. And so that work continues to go on. And one of the projects that I'm really proud of right now is our Ukraine project. And I'm going to show you now where we're at with that. And we've got basically 3 projects going on in Ukraine. The first one is to build, just like the Brave Mind application, to build out worlds that can be used for direct exposure therapy like this. This is a prototype that we had developed about 6-8 months ago. And this took about 3 days to build. We had a good team, but it was just so that we could show it to people, just like we did with the original version of Virtual Iraq. We wanted to show it to people that it was possible to build and that there was going to be a need for this. Now, after this got built, trying to fundraise, and we did get some donations from the University of Southern California, and they donated our software code. And this is one of the worlds that's being worked on now of being in a remote village in Ukraine. And this is a very basic version. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're getting gradually there. We're seeking funding from different.
Two soldiers
sources.
are walking.
This was a demo, the fellow running the demo, and now you've got soldiers walking in. And the fear of they're coming for me next is a very common part of the fear that people that are in these war zones have been experiencing. Another application is to build a metaverse world for social support for Ukrainian refugees. So we took a spherical image of a common place in Ukraine, right here. It's a common square in Ukraine. And let me just pause for a second. And this is a place for social support for people who are spread out over Europe, that had to leave their home, that have lost a lot, and that are uncertain about their future, but are hopeful. And here is our first 3 pilot patients with a clinical psychologist conducting a social support interview in this metaverse world with people located in different parts. These people actually are in Romania.
Нам о своем опыте переезда в Румынию.
Я приехала в Румынию со своими дочками. У меня 2 дочки. Столкнулась с проблемой языкового барьера, конечно.
So these folks typically.
Первое время было тяжело. Но я записалась на курсы и в ближайшее время туда пойду.
Джулас, хотите что-то добавить или рассказать о своем опыте?
So these folks are, you know, they're in a difficult situation. Many of them are actually going back to Ukraine, but to provide them with social support and an option with a clinical care provider where they can meet remotely, and I don't want to say hide behind the avatar, but sometimes people feel more comfortable when they don't have an accurate representation of themselves. They can pick whatever they want to look like, and they can talk more freely. So this is being built out in a more comprehensive fashion as we speak now. Finally, an area for children that, I don't know if you're familiar with play therapy, the sand tray, which is a physical prop that play therapists use with children to get them to tell their story about their trauma, where they can use play objects and tell a story. Sometimes children can't represent the traumatic experiences that they've had. Well, the virtual sand tray developed by Jessica Stone is a tool where a child can go on an iPad and they can build out a virtual world by dragging and dropping objects, and then put a headset on and go into that world with their play therapist and talk about what they're seeing and doing, and maybe some of the things that they went through. Because a lot of times these kids don't know how to talk about their experiences. And this is just how these things are constructed. These are just different panels of content. So it's, basically, a free floating way for a child to create a world where they can tell their story. And this is a key thing. In the United States, there's been a lot of attention to what we call adverse childhood experiences. And there's a direct correlation between the number of adverse childhood experiences of abuse, neglect, and abuse. I mean, real significant assault and abuse. The number of those events that happen in a child's lifetime has a direct impact on their medical and psychological health later in adulthood. And in fact, there was a study that came out last year showing that in this study here on the right, people that had a physical assault, they're civilians, but they had a physical assault, the higher number of these adverse childhood experiences that they had, the higher the incidence of PTSD at 6 months. So I think addressing childhood experiences, maybe, not as, maybe as much as you can as a child, but a little bit more as teenagers, and helping them process those traumas of abuse and neglect, I think are important things for the well-being of folks. Okay, one other area I want to focus on, and then get on to some virtual human work, is the idea of addressing first responders, going beyond combat veterans, people like police officers. In the United States, we have a real problem with police officers assaulting our civilian population. So I've worked with teams to develop virtual reality simulations that teach people how to manage a crisis. So we basically develop these characters to be really annoying and really hostile, as you'll see here.
I don't want to talk about it.
121.
Or
just ran out.
This guy down here.
Why do I have to give you my ID? You can call me Brian, that's all you need to know.
So this is a guy who's mentally ill, who's harassing people.
Get to the point.
Stop.
I'm listening. Am I under arrest?
So you get the point here that giving people training, it's not treating for PTSD, but it may open the door towards that kind of treatment, because a lot of times you find people that interact in these worlds, they get triggered real easy. And if we can spot that, then maybe we can help them to overcome that. And this is one that we just developed for the Los Angeles Police Department for a domestic violence dispute, to help people learn the strategies for de-escalating a situation. But it goes beyond police officers and firefighters and emergency medical technicians to even doctors. The doctor suicide rate is the highest of any profession, and it's significantly higher in men and women than in civilians. And this is before COVID. Nurses have higher level of suicide, a lot of emotional distress in that profession, and that's not even before COVID. This is data from before COVID. So, how does COVID impact? Well, we see a number of studies over time showing that, higher levels of anxiety, depression, insomnia, and general distress. We also see people, this was a study out of China showing that people that got longer COVID had real problems with PTSD afterwards. Military suicide in the United States increased in 2020 compared to 2019, and continued to increase. Opioid use from the stress of the pandemic. We've seen real challenges here where the research shows a high incidence of PTSD due to these kinds of psychological challenges just from COVID. So our view is we need a comprehensive approach. We need to take everything we developed for the military and evolve it and grow it to make it available for civilians, whether they're doctors, whether they're police officers, whether they're children that have been traumatized. And so we do this by coming up with strategies for direct exposure therapy, like what we've done with the veterans and service members, or mindfulness meditation, virtual reality simulations. I know Giuseppe has worked on a number of these types of applications over the years as well. They're becoming more and more common and showing more and more benefit. But also our work with virtual humans to leverage perhaps AI to make it so that people can have interactions with virtual humans in ways that they can maybe benefit from in a positive way. So you saw this video clip. I'm only going to show a little bit of it, of in 2011 of SimCoach. It was an online intelligent agent that service members and veterans could talk to privately, anonymously. They could ask questions about PTSD and no one would find out. They could talk about the problems they were having in their marriage or whatever. The character could ask them questions and also, say, hey, look, it looks like you're having some trouble based on your responses. If you want, you can punch in your postal code here and I can punch up a list of providers in your area. And if you want, I can talk to you about what therapy involves. So it's not about replacing a good clinician, but maybe filling in a gap where somebody isn't going to seek a clinician, but wants to develop some self-understanding. So you've seen this guy. I'll just let him talk for a second.
Well, I'm not a real person, if that's what you're asking, but I'm based on the personality and experience.
You've seen him.
Hi.
But what I want to show you next is the modern version. And this is being tested at Mass General Hospital for doctors and nurses and general medical professionals, where they can go online privately and anonymously and fill out the professional quality of life questionnaire, get an assessment of their burnout, their depression, their anxiety, their sleep disturbances, all privately and anonymously, and then get recommended tips and tactics and treatment possibilities, or directly referred to by to a real clinician.
Hi, my name is Taylor. It is so nice to meet you. You are about to walk through a demonstration of my capabilities. I am going to skip some of the introductory conversation I would have with a real user. Also, for this demo, I will only be accessing a small amount of the knowledge that I have. My trainers have told me I'm not skilled enough yet to go beyond those areas.
So we're taking a very cautious approach, but there is AI leveraged in this, not at the level of ChatGPT, which, of course, everybody has heard about in the last 6 months. I'd like to know how many people never heard of ChatGPT 8 months ago, and then now today everybody knows about it. But our goal is not to replace live clinicians, but to supplement them or to give people access to care that might help them work through their trauma up to a certain point before they might need a real person. And now I want to show something else here. This is a suicide prevention mobile app that has an AI virtual human. It's being built right now. This is being funded by the Veterans Administration. Our team is being funded to build this, and I'll let him describe himself here.
Hello there, and welcome to Battle Buddy, where we combine conversational AI, sensing, wearables, and mobile technology to provide evidence-based wellness content, create and walk veterans in crisis through their personal suicide safety plan, and connect them to appropriate care when needed. My name is Kevin, and I'll be guiding you through our vision for suicide prevention and wellness. No one should ever have to face their toughest moments alone. Everyone deserves a non-judgmental friend that is there when they need them the most. That's what I'm here for. I won't let our vets down. Together, we're stronger. I'm a friend, a partner, a buddy. I've got your six. I am your battle buddy. Thank you for your time.
So this character is one of many that we're envisioning, but this one is for veterans. But we envision that daily check-ins, well, let me take it back a step. one of the problems with mobile apps is that a lot of times in mental health, people go in with good intentions and they want to use a mobile app to improve their mental well-being, but a lot of times they don't stick with it. These things just don't stick that well. We believe that having an intelligent virtual agent that can have a conversation with you on a daily basis for brief periods of time, do positive psychology, do what are the 3 good things that happened today, to help support a focus on gratefulness and so on. But if we can start to do that on a daily basis, then we can start to do other things. And suicide safety planning, which is a very structured approach for people that are at risk for suicide. That is one of the things that we're going to be doing with this. But it could, once we build this version and we hone it well, I believe we can start to build characters that are going to be of relevance for elderly adults, for teenagers with anxiety disorders, with people with disabilities, a friend, a companion, a buddy that may be able to get them through tough times or help them to understand their situation so they can get through those tough times and engage with real people. It's not about this is going to be your friend, that's your only friend. This is about helping somebody to get through these tough times and to grow. So I think it's very much in line with a positive psychology approach. And as the AI technology continues to evolve, I think we're going to be able to have credible interactions that will have a growth-oriented value for people. Okay, finally, there's many of these things that are out there. There's a lot of software being developed that is very realistic for building out virtual humans. This is going to continue to grow, but more importantly are the impact that AI is going to have, and it's going to be good and bad. AI is, ChatGPT co-authored a Journal of Radiology, an article in the Journal of Radiology. It passed the medical licensing exam in the United States. This is a transcript on the left here of a clinical session that was all documented from AI, from listening to the recordings and parsing out the key elements, a real productivity enhancer. And it makes you have concerns about how far should we go in this area. So, what would you think about something like this? Well, aside from that, how far are we from having...
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers are totally confidential. Are you okay with this?
So, are you okay with this? Well, let's talk about the pluses here. A virtual therapist is available 24/7. It has encyclopedic knowledge of every clinical process and every clinical diagnosis. It has unlimited memory of what a patient says to it. You can leverage sensing and big data analytics. It never fatigues. It never gets bored. Those are powerful reasons to use AI in therapy, except there's a lot more to therapy than just facts, figures, and unlimited energy. There's something about the human engagement, the compassion, the empathy. Now, AI is going to challenge that, and we have to be prepared for that, and we have to know where the line is to draw. Recently there was a paper published that if you read carefully, it didn't look as good as what it said, but basically one of the quotes were that the study compared responses from physicians from ChatGPT to real-world health questions. A panel of licensed healthcare professionals preferred ChatGPT's responses 79% of the time and rated ChatGPT responses as higher quality and more empathetic. Now, what they don't say on the front end of this paper was that the people that were providing the input, the real humans, they weren't getting paid. They were just popping up on a chat room and giving advice and giving information. And yeah, if you have a piece of software that is totally focused on something, you might be able to do it better than a human, but that's not always the case. But this will happen. And I want to show you something. This will be the most contentious issue in clinical psychology, generally, all healthcare, as this technology gets better. And we have to be prepared for it. It's going to be the most contentious professional ethical issue leading forward. But I want to show you something, how easy it is to do. I develop mobile apps with video clips. They're TikTok-like video clips for 30 seconds. And they're made for service members, they're made to be very light, to give advice, not really deep clinical care. And it's part of a large project. But here's what that looks like. This is a video clip.
Here are the 3 warning signs that your friend needs help. Number 1, total change in their typical behavior. Instead of hanging out or going and doing this, all of a sudden that stops. Second sign, low energy.
Okay, so that is a very informal little 30-second clip about things to watch out for with anxiety. Now, what you're going to see next is a deep fake of myself, that the voice was created from 30 seconds of free software of my voice. It created a model of my voice, and it used the video clips and modified the video clips to sync with the voice and to move some head movement. And these were the free versions of this software. Let me just make sure that this is off up here. Okay, and here we go.
Congratulations. You have no to low risk of general anxiety disorder. You can breathe a sigh of relief and pat yourself on the back for being such a cool cucumber. But hey, let's not get too cocky now. Just because you're not at risk of general anxiety disorder doesn't mean you should ignore your mental health. Taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. So why not take this opportunity to try some relaxation techniques like meditation, yoga, or just enjoying a good old-fashioned nap. And if you ever do start to feel overwhelmed, don't hesitate to reach out for help. But for now, let's celebrate your low-risk score with a virtual high five. Hell yeah.
So that was all fake. But I could type that in. I could have plugged ChatGPT into it, and people could have a conversation with a ChatGPT version of me. Not that they would want to, but anyway. So these are the things that we have to be concerned about. So I don't have time certainly to go through all of these, but I just want to point out some of the key things that we have to face as a body of clinicians looking forward into the future so that we can ensure the ethical and professional delivery of clinical care, but in a way that reduces the gaps, that improves access to care. Barriers to care are just as important as the efficacy issues. And so I think that's an important thing. So finally, I just want to conclude with my niece and nephew with their first VR headset back in 2016, Samsung Gear VR. But I want to bring somebody back onto the stage here, my mom. And this was the day before that video was taken, on the day before Christmas, actually. And it was the first time she had tried modern VR.
It's so real.
This is 3 in the morning.
It looks like my backyard, my yard with the snow. Oh, Lord in heaven. How they ever can create this. You know what? I'm hanging onto the sink because I'm afraid I'm going to fall down the cliff. Yeah, honest to God. You feel like, if you step off, you're going to fall right in there. Holy mackerel.
And one more answer to the question, Alex, you would ask me about getting funding in the United States. I have to beg too.
If you're watching this, please fund my son's research so that he can take care of me in my old age.
Okay. with that, if you're interested in more detail on the specifics of the PTSD work and the spectrum of work that I've talked about, send me an email and I'll send you a copy of this article. And I think I am just about done. Thank you for your time and attention.